DC action figure collectors have it rough, and they have for a long time. Over the last decade, we've seen line after line come out with no true one definitive option like Hasbro's Marvel Legends line. Today, I want to break down what makes a good action figure line, why DC has struggled so long to get there, and what I call the decade-long DC action figure problem. But before we get into the toys, we need to take a second and look at the DC fandom as a whole. Not only have the collectors had it rough, but DC fans have been getting the short end of the stick for a while. If you look back at the 2010s, Marvel easily ruled the decade. The MCU became one of history's highest-grossing film series, their video games were huge, and to the general public, that's all you needed. Meanwhile, outside of Nolan's Batman trilogy, DC struggled to have the same cultural impact. The CW shows aged like milk even at the time, their animated shows and movies started to fall off, and their films were inconsistent at best and horrendous at worst. But it wasn't always this way. Before Raimi's Spider-Man or Singer's X-Men, it was Donner's Superman and Burton's Batman that really launched this whole superhero movie era we're still in years later. DC has just as much of a rich history and just as many iconic stories as Marvel, and their heroes literally inspired so many Marvel characters. The problem is while Marvel was releasing Winter Soldier and Infinity War, DC was putting out films like Suicide Squad and Wonder Woman 84. So for the average moviegoer outside of Batman, DC was completely inferior to Marvel. The thing is, to the general public, DC should be standing shoulder to shoulder with Marvel, not firmly in second place. And that imbalance in the public consciousness absolutely carried over into the toy aisles. DC collectors need their Marvel Legends equivalent as a toy line. A line with a consistent scale, wide selection of characters, accessible to the general consumer, highly articulated, and a good value overall. Every DC line we've had over the years has lacked one of those things. There's never been one definitive line domestically. All of the main action figure lines are in weird scales and never match each other. We're going to look at every main line of DC figures, but for example, if you're a McFarlane toy collector, your figures will look way out of scale with your DC icons. Or if you collected DC Universe classics for years, they don't match your DC essentials at all. Batman is taller than Superman, who's shorter than the Flash. It just doesn't look right. And options for characters in general are just so limited domestically. There's basically no way to get D-list characters since DC Universe classics ended. The DC Universe is filled with diverse characters, and we haven't gotten plenty of them. If you decide to forego domestic figures and think, hey, that's okay, I'll just buy imports, that comes with its own set of problems. So now that we know what we want, let's take a look at the lines we've had in the past, their strengths and weaknesses, and see if we can finally get the DC line of our dreams. In the mid-2000s, Mattel released their Batman and then DC Superheroes toy line, followed up by the more prominent DC Universe Classics as a competitor to Marvel Legends. These figures were great for the time as, like them or not, the line was very consistent within itself. DC UC figures looked good next to DC UC figures, which cannot be said about other lines coming out around the same time, or even today. The best thing DC Universe Classics did was tackle the DC Universe as a whole. They offered a vast character selection. They were decently affordable and well-stocked at most retail stores. At the time, they were what DC fans needed. Yes, you'd get your fair share of Batmans, but you'd also get characters like Cyclotron, Big Barda, and Eclipso. Later, they even copied Marvel Legends' Build-A-Figure system, where each figure you'd purchase came with a piece of a much larger figure you could build. I also love that these were strictly comic figures. They were bright and colorful, and most importantly, they touched on plenty of different eras of continuity. These figures in concept were perfect, but in execution, they struggled in some essential areas. The articulation was not ideal. It was passable at the time, but in 2025, these are just way too limited. They stuck with this weird crotch joint, and almost every joint on the figure was single jointed. And since most of the figures shared the same body mold, if you didn't like that buck, you were straight up out of luck for most of the figures in this line. There were obvious exceptions like the Penguin, Parasite, and Man-Bat, but a majority of the figures ended up looking pretty similar. Not to mention most of their female figures were even worse, and figures in this line rarely came with any accessories. All that being said, I truly feel like DC UC was good for its time, and I'm definitely biased because these were some of my first 6-inch figures. These were taken off the shelves around 2012, right as I was getting into collecting, but I still remember looking at the full pegs of these figures and being in awe. Without the nostalgia bug though, I'm not sure how well these would hold up. Unfortunately, when DC Universe Classics ended, Mattel didn't really learn any lessons. Instead, their follow-up DC Multiverse line felt like a step backwards and had its own issues. This was essentially the only line out at the time, so if you wanted DC figures, these were your best option. Just like DCUC, their articulation was pretty bad, and especially bad for the time. Compare these live action figures to what Hasbro was doing around the same time, and it's actually laughable. That's another thing this line struggled with, its overwhelming amount of live action figures. They would make sure to make all of the figures from the current films at the time, most of which sucked, and the figures weren't much better. Not only was the articulation still terrible, but the likenesses were horrendous. These toys were made with an often gummy, cheap-feeling plastic and awful paint apps. These were sometimes worse than the Movie Masters. It wasn't all bad. It technically was very accessible, probably since nobody wanted these, and they did make a lot of unique sculpts. By the last couple waves, the line actually did improve, with a few actually good figures, but it was too little, too late. DC Direct, later known as DC Collectibles, is the line I have the least amount of experience with, as it was mostly relegated to comic and specialty shops. DC Direct released before and alongside DC Universe Classics, beginning in the late 90s with comic figures and busts. If Mattel's offerings were marketed towards everyone, DC Direct was marketed towards older collectors, in my opinion. They had many sublines over the years, some more loved than others, but the best thing this line had was great variety. Most waves or sublines they did were based on comic runs and adapted literal comic art styles, which is more rare than you'd think. Figures that would adapt full comic stories would come in packaging made to look like the comics, so you couldn't mistake it for just a standard superhero toy. If you bought the Hush Batman, it was the Hush Batman. A lot of the sculpts were very faithful and have aged pretty well. As you can see here, the figures were very statuesque, which if you only buy the figures to stay in the package or live on a shelf, that's cool. But for me, these moved like a brick, and the appeal of being a mini statue was a big downside. These were also just harder to find, not that they were super expensive, but unless you went looking for them, you'd hardly come across one of them. The next two segments were lines under DC Collectibles, but felt significant enough to talk a bit more in depth about them, as I would argue that DC Icons and DC Essentials are the closest we've ever come to having a Marvel Legends equivalent. For many collectors, Icons felt like a fresh start, and the line they'd been asking for. DC Icons offered a decent variety of characters in its limited run, and unlike DCUC, most figures were on their own bodies, or at least felt distinct enough from each other. This line felt fresh, and especially at the time, these figures were great. I always look at this Damian Wayne Robin as an example of a figure that holds up perfectly. The sculpted details are all there, and the quality of paint is really nice. They also had some articulation systems that were more advanced than even Marvel Legends, like the ball joint waist on their first Batman. The line was not perfect, the joints could be too tight at times, and plastic could be really fragile in key areas, but by far the biggest drawback of DC Icons was its scaling. The line was shorter than every 6-inch line that came before it, and when you put these figures next to each other, they just don't match well. It was such a disappointment, especially when these figures were coming out, because DC was so close to perfection with this line. The figures from DC Icons I do have, I still love. It's a shame we didn't get more figures from this short-lived line. They feel higher quality as toys than anything we've covered so far. If they were just a little taller and more accessible as these were relegated to specialty stores, we could have had our dream line. DC Essentials was the follow-up to Icons, and it seemed to have solved the scaling issues Icons had. These were much more in line with Legends, and did things a bit differently than Icons. This line was very short-lived, even shorter than Icon's lifespan, and were also relegated to comic shops and stores like GameStop. They made the figures taller and took a page out of DCUC's book and put a majority of them on the same body mold. This wouldn't be too bad if the main mold was great, but unfortunately, it's not. The proportions are distracting. Look how long these arms are. The figures just look wonky. They also were even more stiff than their predecessor. These have most of the articulation points you'd need, but they just don't pose very well. The plastic they chose chips a bit too. From what I can tell, they painted the plastic instead of molding the figures in different colored plastic. It's a real bummer because they were good offerings. I remember getting this Red Hood and being obsessed with how good he looked. If only these figures moved as good as they sometimes looked, we'd have a great line on our hands. And that brings us to the present day, 2025, where McFarlane Toys rules the DC section of the toy aisle and has since 2020. I'm gonna say it plainly, I am not a big fan of what McFarlane Toys has done with the DC license in their 5 years. But to start with the positives, because I know this line has its many fans, I gotta respect how accessible these figures are. For the majority of them, they're always in stock, you can find them everywhere. The fact that a kid can go to the store and find a Batman figure they want and he's actually there is appreciated. Even with Marvel Legends, there are so many figures that I have never seen on the pegs. These figures need to be accessible to collectors of all ages and backgrounds, and you shouldn't have to be eternally plugged in online to be able to buy a toy. Another thing McFarlane does well is their sculpting. Sometimes the sculpts can look wonky, but there is just so much sculpting, which cannot be said for practically any past DC line. Every figure feels completely different from the next. They truly take detailing to the next level. That being said, these figures struggle in so many other areas that it's hard to justify the $25 for me personally. Their articulation is not good, and just like DC Essentials, it looks like they have the correct joints, but once you get one in your hands, you'll see how stiff and immobile these things really are. Also, their joints are so clunky, they're bulky, and the pins are huge, and good luck getting some good leg movement out of these. They all come with this rubber diaper piece that covers their hip joints, which is supposed to help conceal the ugly joint system, but for me, it just gets in the way. Not to mention the horrendous face sculpts this line will churn out, these figures can be plain ugly more often than not. There are never enough accessories, if any at all, and swappable hands, forget it. And the worst sin of all, I cannot believe I have to say this again, but the figures are too big. Why can't we have a normal 6-inch scale DC line? It's been years, I just want my domestic superhero figures to all scale together, at least relatively. Is that so hard? And what's worse is this line doesn't even scale well within itself. The figures don't even look good next to each other, so forget putting your Batman next to your Spider-Man. Speaking of Batman, a common criticism of this line is just how many Batman figures McFarlane puts out. You'd think it was called McFarlane Batverse with how many Batman figures they release. I don't need to regurgitate all of the past arguments against McFarlane, there are plenty of videos out there that do it better than I ever could. But I'm disappointed that this has been the line DC fans have been given for the last 5 years. Of course, while domestic lines have struggled, import companies have been picking up some of the slack. If you're like me, this is where you get most of your DC figures these days. I love the Mafex Hush and Dark Knight Returns lines, and I just made a video on the in-art Batman. I also have a few Mezco figures, and even though they're not technically imports, I love those too. These aren't domestic lines, but it seems to be the way most people are buying DC figures outside of McFarlane. The problem with only collecting imports is the severe lack of character selection. You'll never see deep-cut villains or heroes from companies like Kyoto, Medicom, or Tamashii, and it makes sense, because who would buy them? The list of people who would spend $100 on a Calendar Man or Wildcat is really short, but the amount of people who would buy $20 versions of these characters is a lot longer. We don't need expensive Japanese import figures for every character, which is why having a cheap, accessible domestic line is so important. I love my imports, but they're more centerpiece figures rather than a way to collect a whole universe, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. And that's what makes all of this so frustrating, because we know that DC collectors and kids deserve better than this. At its peak in the late 2000s, early 2010s, you could collect DC Universe Classics and DC Direct simultaneously and get a lot of variety, which is better than today where your only real option is McFarlane, but they still never really fit together, unlike Marvel's offerings in the past. If you started buying Spider-Man Classics in the early 2000s or the return of Marvel Legends in 2012, they would still scale pretty well with current figures. Obviously, there have been so many improvements in toy technology over the years, but even if parts are outdated, a 2012 Marvel Legend can still look good next to a modern one. Put a DC UC next to a McFarlane next to an Icons. It just doesn't work. The difference between these two scenarios is that since the late 2000s, the same company has had the license for Marvel and hasn't stopped making figures. Why can't DC have that too? How can a DC fan be expected to build a collection of their favorite parts of DC when they have to start over every 5 years, or their collection looks like an out-of-scale mess? In 2026, Mattel is getting the DC license back from McFarlane, but if their offerings are like what they were putting out in 2019, I'll be severely disappointed. I wish a company like Jada Toys could get the DC license, a company that puts out fewer figures, but every figure they put out is quality. They could take their time and put out high-quality figures that will stand the test of time, and if they kept the license long enough, we'd be able to get more of the deep-cut characters. Although McFarlane has improved in this area over the years, it just feels like too little too late. In the end, DC collectors deserve better. We deserve a line that's consistent, affordable, full of diverse characters with the articulation and accessories collectors expect. Marvel fans have had that luxury for years, and DC fans deserve it too. Maybe Mattel's return in 2026 will deliver that, but until then, all we can do is keep collecting what our budget allows and keep hoping for the DC line we've been waiting for. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.